The hidden sign avoidants show when they're deeply in love isn't what most people expect it to be. Because the moment you hear avoidant, your mind probably paints a picture of someone cold, distant, emotionally unavailable, someone who doesn't care enough to stay. But that picture starts to crack the moment you actually look closer. Because what if the absence you feel isn't emptiness at all but restraint? And what if the distance isn't rejection but a form of protection they don't even fully understand themselves? The strange part is, the more deeply an avoidant feels, the less obvious they become about it. Almost like their emotions go underground instead of coming to the surface, and that's where most people misunderstand them completely. If you've ever been confused by someone who seems calm on the outside but inconsistent in ways you can't explain, who disappears emotionally but never fully lets go, then you're already standing inside this story without even realizing it. And before we go deeper, if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of psychological truths that nobody really talks about, consider subscribing, because this space is exactly where we break down the patterns people feel but can't explain. The biggest misunderstanding about avoidance is the assumption that they simply don't feel enough, or that their silence is proof of emotional absence, when in reality it's often the opposite. They don't lack emotion. They struggle with what to do with it when it gets too intense, too close, too real. So instead of expressing love in the way most people recognize, they begin to manage it, control it, sometimes even hide from it inside their own behavior. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring too deeply creates a kind of internal pressure they were never taught how to hold. So they learn early on that the safest way to love is quietly, indirectly, without fully exposing themselves to the vulnerability that comes with being seen. And because of that, their love often gets mistaken for indifference, when in truth it's often carefully contained emotion trying not to spill over. And that's where the first hidden shift begins, the silence that feels different. Not the kind of silence that pushes you away or shuts you out, but the kind that still feels like someone is there, even when they're not actively engaging. It's subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, like the energy between two people has changed, but no one can point out exactly how or why. With avoidance, silence doesn't always mean distance. Sometimes it means presence without performance, connection without constant expression. They might not be filling every space with words, but they're still there in a way that feels strangely consistent, almost like they're observing life instead of stepping away from it. And if you pay close attention, you start to notice that their silence isn't empty, it's structured, intentional, like they're holding something inside themselves rather than cutting you off. Then there's the part that confuses people the most. They don't chase, but they don't fully disappear either. It creates this emotional in-between space where nothing feels stable enough to define, yet nothing feels fully gone either. One moment they seem close, almost engaged, and the next they retreat just enough to make you question everything. But what's often missed is that this isn't random. When an avoidant is deeply in love, they don't fully detach the way people assume they would. Instead, they hover in this controlled distance, close enough to stay connected, far enough to stay safe. It's like they're constantly managing the tension between wanting closeness and fearing what closeness demands of them. So instead of running away completely, they create a rhythm of presence and absence that feels confusing on the surface, but deeply emotional underneath. And within that rhythm, something even more subtle begins to emerge. They start observing instead of expressing. Where others might talk through their feelings, they start collecting information silently, noticing patterns, remembering details you didn't think mattered, studying emotional reactions without announcing it. It's not detachment, it's engagement in a quieter form. Their mind becomes the place where connection happens first, long before it ever shows up in conversation. They might not say much about how they feel, but they are tracking everything, absorbing everything, almost like love becomes something they analyze internally rather than display externally. And if you don't understand this shift, it can feel like they're pulling away, when in reality, they're getting more involved in a way that doesn't look like involvement at all. And once you start noticing that pattern of quiet observation, something even more unexpected begins to surface in them. Small actions that replace what used to be big, obvious expressions. It's not sudden grand gestures or emotional declarations, it's subtle consistency disguised as something ordinary. They might remember something you mentioned weeks ago without ever telling you they remembered it, or they might adjust their behavior in ways that feel almost invisible unless you're paying close attention. This is where their love stops being performative and starts becoming embedded in behavior itself. They don't always say what they feel, but they begin to structure their actions around it, like love is no longer something they announce but something they integrate into their decisions. And the strange part is, because it lacks dramatic expression, people often miss it completely, assuming nothing is happening when in reality everything is shifting beneath the surface in a way that is far more stable than it looks. But just as those small signals start to build a sense of quiet connection, something even more fragile appears beneath it all: the first crack in their emotional armor. It doesn't come as a breakdown or a confession, it comes as hesitation, inconsistency, or a moment where their usual emotional control slips just enough for you to notice something different. Maybe they respond faster than usual one day, or say something slightly more personal than they intended, and then immediately return to distance as if trying to repair the exposure. It's not that they suddenly become someone else, it's that the structure they rely on to stay emotionally regulated starts to bend under the weight of what they're feeling. And what makes this moment so powerful is that they often don't even recognize it as vulnerability. To them, it feels like a minor lapse. But from the outside, it's one of the clearest signs that something deeper is breaking through the surface. And right after that crack appears, something else begins to quietly surface. They start sharing things that don't seem necessary. Not confessions of love or emotional declarations, but random fragments of thought, small details about their day, or memories that seem too ordinary to mention. On the surface, it might feel meaningless, but emotionally it's the opposite. For someone who is naturally guarded, sharing anything without being asked is already a shift in internal safety. They are not just communicating information, they are slowly allowing you into the parts of their mind that they usually keep closed off. And what makes this even more significant is the lack of awareness behind it. They don't announce it as intimacy, they don't frame it as emotional progress, they just do it, as if something inside them is quietly loosening without permission. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of this shift, it can feel confusing at first because it doesn't match the intensity of traditional emotional connection, yet somehow feels more personal than anything they've said before. But underneath these subtle openings, there's still a fear they rarely articulate, a fear that shapes almost everything they do without them fully realizing it. It's not simply the fear of love itself, but the fear of losing control once love becomes real. Because for them, emotional closeness isn't just connection, it's exposure. And exposure feels unpredictable. The deeper they care, the more they feel themselves being pulled into a space where they can no longer manage every emotional outcome in advance. So instead of leaning fully into it, they begin to regulate the intensity by stepping back just enough to feel safe again. This is why their behavior often feels contradictory, because internally they are constantly negotiating between wanting closeness and needing control. And that negotiation doesn't always look logical from the outside, but inside their mind, it feels like survival. And that internal conflict leads directly into one of the most confusing patterns of all. They pull away right before getting closer. Just when things feel like they are stabilizing, just when emotional closeness starts to form, they create distance again, almost instinctively. It's not a decision they consciously enjoy making, it's a reflex built from years of associating emotional intensity with loss of control. So when connection reaches a certain threshold, their system reacts by stepping back, not because they want to leave, but because staying feels like too much at once. And what makes this so difficult to understand is that from the outside it looks like inconsistency or disinterest, but internally it's actually the exact moment where their feelings are strongest. The closer they get emotionally, the more they feel the need to reset distance, not to end the connection, but to make it manageable enough to survive. And just when that push and pull starts to feel like the whole story, there's another pattern that quietly reveals what most people miss entirely: the return. Because avoidant love doesn't move in a straight line, it loops. They step back, they create space, they disappear emotionally, just enough to feel safe again, but then something always pulls them back in, and it's rarely dramatic. There's no grand apology, no emotional explanation that ties everything neatly together. Instead, they return as if distance never fully erased the connection in the first place, almost like they assume the bond is still intact in silence. To an outside perspective, this can feel confusing or even inconsistent, but emotionally, it's actually one of the clearest signs that the attachment never truly broke. They don't always know how to stay close, but they also don't fully know how to let go. So they exist in this cycle of retreat and re-entry, where leaving is temporary but connection is permanent in a quieter form. And inside that loop, something far more subtle holds everything together: the hidden loyalty signal. It's not expressed through constant reassurance or verbal commitment, but through persistence in the background of distance. Even when they pull away, they don't fully detach emotionally. There's still awareness, still monitoring, still an unspoken thread that remains intact no matter how much time or space passes. They might not be actively engaged, but they are not absent in the way true disconnection looks. And this is where things get deeply misunderstood, because most people equate emotional distance with emotional loss, when in reality for them, distance is often just a way to regulate intensity without severing attachment. So even in silence, there's a kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, but quietly refuses to disappear. And as that invisible thread continues to hold, something begins to shift in how they perceive the other person entirely. They start noticing emotions more than before, not in an obvious or expressive way, but in a deeply observational way. They begin to pick up on subtle changes in tone, timing, energy, and behavior that they would normally overlook. It's as if emotional awareness starts expanding in them without conscious effort, almost like love forces them to become more perceptive, even if they don't fully express it. This is one of the most important internal shifts because it marks a transition from self-contained emotional processing to relational awareness. They are no longer just managing their own internal state, they are beginning to register yours with surprising accuracy. And while they may not always respond emotionally in the moment, they are absorbing far more than they let on, storing emotional patterns that quietly influence how they behave later. And that shift naturally leads into another quiet transformation. They start adjusting their behavior, but only in subtle fragments. Not in ways that feel performative or obvious, but in ways that feel almost accidental unless you look closely. They might soften their tone, respond slightly differently, or make small compromises they would normally resist without hesitation. And what makes this so significant is not the size of the change, but the fact that it exists at all. For someone who typically relies on emotional independence and control, even minor behavioral adjustments signal that something deeper is influencing their actions. It's not about losing themselves in the relationship, it's about their internal systems slowly recalibrating around someone they cannot fully detach from. And the most interesting part is that they rarely label this as emotional growth or attachment. It just happens quietly, without announcement, as if love is rewriting small parts of their behavior without asking permission first. And because these changes remain so subtle, their version of vulnerability often goes unnoticed by most people. It doesn't look like emotional confession or deep verbal expression. Instead, it shows up in ordinary behavior that carries unusual weight when you understand what it costs them internally. A moment of honesty, a slightly longer conversation, a response that doesn't shut things down immediately, these are the kinds of openings that might seem normal on the surface, but are actually deeply significant in their emotional world. Their vulnerability doesn't announce itself as vulnerability. It hides inside everyday interactions, disguised so well that even they might not fully recognize it as emotional exposure. And that is what makes it so easy to miss and so important to understand, because what looks simple from the outside is often the result of internal resistance being quietly softened over time. And slowly, all of this leads into something that doesn't have a clear label, but changes everything: the silent commitment phase. There is no declaration, no label, no emotional speech that marks the beginning of it. Instead, it forms through repetition, consistency, and quiet presence that remains steady even when distance appears. They may still struggle with expression, they may still step back when things feel intense, but something fundamental changes in the way they stay connected. The connection stops being something they actively evaluate and starts becoming something they simply continue. And that continuation, even without verbal confirmation, becomes its own form of commitment. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it is persistent. And in their world, persistence often speaks louder than words ever could. And yet, even inside that quiet form of commitment, there's one question that lingers underneath everything they do. Why is it so hard for them to say what seems so simple to everyone else? Why does something like "I love you," something that carries so much weight for others, feel almost heavier for them than the entire emotional experience itself? The truth is, it's not the feeling they struggle with, it's the translation of it. Because for them, words are not just expressions, they are bindings. Once something is said out loud, it becomes real in a way that cannot be taken back, edited, or emotionally distanced from later. And that level of permanence can feel overwhelming when their internal world is still learning how to stay stable under emotional intensity. So instead of speaking what they feel directly, they try to prove it through patterns, through presence, through consistency that doesn't require verbal exposure. And to them, that feels safer, more controlled, more honest than words that might lock them into emotional expectations they're not sure they can manage. But what makes this even more layered is that, even while they avoid saying it, they are constantly experiencing the weight of it internally. It's not silence because nothing is there. It's silence because too much is there at once. The emotion builds, expands, and settles in places they don't always have language for, which is why it often comes out sideways, in actions instead of statements, in timing instead of declarations, in presence instead of explanation. And this is where most misunderstandings happen, because people tend to trust words more than behavior, when in reality their emotional truth often lives entirely in behavior. So while they might struggle to articulate love in a direct way, they are often already living inside it in the way they choose to stay, return, adjust, and remain connected, even when it would be easier not to. And when you step back and look at everything together, the silence that feels intentional, the distance that never fully disconnects, the subtle observation, the small actions that replace big expressions, the cracks in their emotional armor, the return patterns, the silent loyalty, the behavioral adjustments, and the unspoken commitment, it starts to form a picture that doesn't look like absence at all. It looks like a different language of love, one that doesn't rely on volume but on continuity, because their love is rarely defined by how loudly it is expressed, but by how consistently it resists disappearing completely. Even when it retreats, even when it hides, even when it becomes unrecognizable on the surface, it still leaves traces behind that continue shaping their behavior long after the emotional moment has passed. And that's where the final truth begins to settle in, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet realization that changes the way everything else is understood. Their love was never meant to look like what most people expect love to look like. It was never designed for constant verbal reassurance or visible emotional intensity. Instead, it exists in the space between presence and distance, in the tension between fear and attachment, in the slow accumulation of actions that only make sense when viewed over time instead of in moments. And once you understand that, the confusion starts to dissolve, because what once looked like inconsistency begins to reveal a pattern, and what once looked like emotional absence begins to show emotional restraint instead. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this: they are not showing less love, they are showing it differently in a way that often goes unnoticed until you learn how to recognize the quieter signs. Their love doesn't always announce itself, it doesn't always stay steady in expression, and it doesn't always follow emotional expectations set by more openly expressive attachment styles. But it exists in repetition, in return, in observation, in subtle adjustments, in the refusal to fully disconnect even when distance would be easier. And when you put all of those fragments together, what you're left with is not emptiness, but something far more understated and far more complex. A love that survives not by intensity, but by persistence. So when you look back at everything, the hidden sign was never just one action or one moment. It was the pattern itself, the way they stay connected without fully exposing themselves, the way they leave without truly letting go, the way they observe more than they speak, the way they return without explanation, the way they adjust without announcement, and the way they remain even in silence, in ways that are easy to miss if you're only looking for loud proof of love. Because in the end, their deepest emotional truth is not something they declare, it's something they continuously, quietly, and almost invisibly live out.